In the summer of 1995, China sent a bunch of its troops to the province of Fujian. They then started testing missiles and putting it on TV. They then started running highly publicized combat exercises, very similar to what it would look like to cross this 130-kilometer wide strait to invade the island of Taiwan, a place that China doesn't think is a real country, but rather a part of China itself, a rebellious island province in an unfinished civil war.
Another round of Chinese war games near Taiwan has the U.S. and other nations concerned.
China did all this saber-rattling because Taiwan's president had asked for a visa to visit the United States, and the U.S. Congress voted to give it to him, defying Beijing and undermining China's claim to Taiwan. Oh, and Taiwan was holding their first democratic election.
These are the first free elections of a Chinese leader in 5,000
China
years.
announced Friday that it would start the new military exercises less than a week before Taiwan's presidential election.
China hated that all of this was happening on this island that they think is theirs, hence all of the military flexing. But look who shows up next.
Diplomatic trouble may be brewing again between China and the United States.
It's the U.S. military, and they're sending their biggest show of military force in Asia since the Vietnam War, right here in China's neighborhood. President Bill Clinton sent in all of the U.S.'s best stuff, aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, and learn how conflict works, and what calculations all the countries involved would have to make in what might become the next world war.
I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back.
China's aggression against Taiwan is accelerating, and it's blaming the U.S.
Beijing has been getting increasingly tough on Taiwan.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense?
Taiwan. It basically says that if Taiwan tries to assert its independence from China, or, and this is the most important part, or if the possibilities for on the island of Taiwan, support for any sort of reunification is at an all-time low. Like, it's not looking like peaceful reunification is gonna happen, which is making the interpretation of this law
Concern at the Pentagon about China's military buildup.
with all sorts of new missiles.
China could soon be able to deploy a nuclear-tipped missile that U.S. defenses would find much harder to detect.
Tanks, helicopters, submarines, ships. I mean, this isn't from me, this is the US government. They recently came out with a report that said that the Chinese Navy now is bigger than the US's Navy, at least by numbers. They have 360 versus our 297.
And as this problem is much closer to us than most think, we have to take this on with urgency.
China is upping the ante on Taiwan.
And there are fresh fears of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Taking over Taiwan remains China's #1 strategic priority.
Confident that the only way that Taiwan is going to join China, which is again a legal imperative, is if they forcibly invade. Blockade isn't working, negotiation isn't working. The first strike on Taiwan would likely look like just another Chinese provocative ADIZ flyover. China's done this hundreds of times, so at this point Taiwan thinks that they're just doing another one of their routine flex our military might exercises. But this time, the fighter jet turns towards the island and begins firing. At the same time, China fires guided missiles from the mainland and deploys tons more jets, and they all start firing in a fast, highly coordinated attack. Like weapons that can shoot down planes or boats that are coming onto the island. I mean, this could be anything. Radar, communication nodes, military command centers, navy bases, bridges, communication networks, power stations, even government buildings. They would have a wide variety of targets to effectively deny Taiwan the ability to respond effectively. I mean, unfortunately for Taiwan, a lot of these targets are left out in the open. They're easy to see. A runway is really easy to see and really hard to hide. This first attack would happen very quickly. It could be expected to be concentrated in a short time frame as a prelude to invasion with no pauses other than those required for moving, reloading, and repairing. Taiwan's leaders are caught off guard and they immediately retreat underground to a command bunker where they can plan their response. Luckily, China will not be able to take out all of their military targets. Some of their aircraft hangars are deep in mountains, and some of their missile sites are really well camouflaged. They would escape the bombardment, so Taiwan would have the ability to respond. They would likely be able to get some air power into the air and fire some missiles towards mainland China to hit air bases, radar, and military batteries on the mainland. At this point, Taiwan also sends troops to their western beaches to start laying mines and preparing for an oncoming barrage of Chinese troops who are probably now on their way across the strait. This has all happened within just a few hours. And back over in the strait, Taiwan's military assets are severely damaged, and China is now sending hundreds of thousands of troops and loads of supplies across this 130-kilometer stretch of water. They're using boats of all kinds, military boats, merchant boats that don't need to defend themselves because Taiwan can't respond adequately, and each of these vessels is carrying tons of supplies and troops. But again, on Taiwan's western beaches, there are probably Taiwanese troops who have been planting mines ready for this invasion. So there's now a battle on the beaches as Chinese amphibious attackers, assuming Taiwan doesn't give up and capitulate and surrender to China at this point. If that's the case, the US is now just starting to respond, likely from their bases in the region, Japan and Guam. They deploy aircraft carriers with jets and bombers, stealth fighters, as well as fast attack submarines that will focus on one thing: hitting all of these ships, the ones that are bringing stuff and people across the strait. Japan and Australia likely come in as allies to help out on this defense. And now the US and its allies are in direct combat with China. Two nuclear nations fighting each other, where China actually strikes first, hitting US bases in Japan and Guam at the same time that they hit their initial targets in Taiwan. This would be a much more provocative move and would certainly bring the US full force into a war with China. So now you have Chinese troops who have pushed back the Taiwanese defense on the western beaches, and they are now moving in towards major city centers. The US is fighting on the water and in the air, and from here it becomes impossible to predict what could happen next. There are so many different directions. Depending on the US's tolerance for bloodshed, there could be American troops on the ground trying to push back Chinese advancements inland. But if you look at Chinese military writings on this, you'll see that predict that India will take advantage of this moment of chaos and invade the Himalayan borders to the south. They even foresee Tibetan freedom fighters way out here in the west who have long been hostile towards Chinese rule, rising up and taking advantage of the instability to gain back control of their region. I mean, you can see how this starts to unfold. Before you know it, the entire region is devolving into a war that threatens to engulf many more. He deserves land that the rest of the world says isn't his. So he uses his big, powerful army to go take it. And in the process, he sparks a horrible tragedy. And while I hope more than anything that doesn't happen in this case, we have to remember how commonplace it is, and that the peace between these big powers is actually the outlier here. I really hope that we are past needing to resort to this version of conflict to settle our disputes at this time in our history. But I'm not totally convinced that we are yet. And I think China and Taiwan, this specific case, is the best thing to look at to test whether or not we can. We can talk about it. We can find creative ways to solve this instead of resorting to the thing humans have done forever, which is just fight each other and see who wins.